Hello, in this lesson we're going to learn how to use construction script to create a dynamic material instance and be able to use it to provide a visual look to an asset that can be adjusted on a per instance basis within the editor. So in the previous lesson we created this rusty metal material and we had created it to be dynamic by using this scalar parameter. So what we're going to be able to do now is take this material, create a dynamic instance of it, and then be able to script how this material is actually created and rendered on top of a static mesh. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go and get our static mesh that we're going to use this material on. So we need to go into our static meshes folder inside of Content Browser 2. And we need to go find our swing set mesh. So go ahead and double click to open that. Now this swing set is in basically three parts in terms of how the materials are applied. We have one on the swing itself, one that we can highlight here on the bars, and one on the overall framework. So the framework is where we want to add this rusty metal. So let's go ahead and change this material to actually be the rusty metal material that we made last lesson. Now you'll notice there's no change right now, and that's because inside of our rusty metal we have the blend value set to 0. If we adjusted this to say 1 and then click apply, now when we go over to our swing set we can now see that there's a little bit of rust on the swing set here, which is pretty much exactly what we want. Now we want to be able to dynamically control that, so let's set the blend back to 0 and then click enter to enter that value and click apply. Now back in our swing set there's one other thing that we need to pay attention to here, and that is this is called element 2, and this is what we're wanting to actually be dynamic. So we need to remember that element 2 is the number for this particular material element. That'll come up in a couple minutes when we're setting this up. So let's actually go ahead and save this static mesh because we've adjusted its material. Now let's go back to our Park tab, and you can kind of maybe tell what we were going for, but we now have a very nice slab of concrete here, and we could just right click on here and say place actor SM_swing set, and there's our swing set, and that actually looks pretty good. Let me actually rotate this a little bit though, and maybe it'll look better like this. I like that a little better. So now that we've placed this, this is a static mesh, so if we were to play right now we are going to get this warning that we need to rebuild lighting, and that's fine. We can do that between videos. So let's go ahead and hit escape to stop. Now we're wanting to make this dynamically have that material, meaning that we're going to be able to change a single number inside of our details panel for this static mesh to be able to adjust how much rust is on this swing set. In order to do that though, we need to actually script inside of construction script. In order to do that it needs to be a blueprint. So what we're going to do is, with this highlighted, we're going to use a new feature in Unreal Engine 4.7, which is this button right here, which is going to convert this particular actor into a reusable blueprint. So let's click on blueprint, and let's go ahead and click on our blueprints folder so we can save it here, and let's actually just call this BP Rusty Swing Set. And we'll go ahead and click create blueprint, and it'll go ahead and pop us right to the content browser here to show us where we've made this, and then we can go and click on this blueprint, and it's already opened it for us, so we can see that we have our swing set. Now if we look inside our components tab, what it's done is it has taken a static mesh component and made it the root component, but it also says inherited here. And that's because it basically inherited a static mesh component. So basically what happened was whenever you place a static mesh in your levels, what actually it's doing is placing a static mesh component that's basically just sitting there in the level rendering that static mesh for you. So when you turn it into a blueprint, it basically derives a blueprint from that static mesh component, is basically what happened there. So still though, we have our blueprint that has a construction script. So what we're going to do is go ahead and start scripting this construction script. So the first thing we need to do is actually create our dynamic material. So if we right click and just search for create, you will actually see immediately right at the top, create dynamic material instance and a reference to our static mesh component. So we can actually go ahead and click on that. And this actually combines a couple nodes together. So this is a new feature in Unreal Engine 4.7 as well. It combines a couple nodes together. One is actually creating the material, the dynamic material, and the second one is actually assigning that material to a specific node. So that's what this element index is. So if you remember, I called out we needed to remember that number 2. So if we go back to our swing set static mesh, we see element 2. This is the element that we have created our rusty metal on. So we've set it as the default here, but what we're actually going to do here is replace that particular element number. So again, the element index being 2. We're going to replace the material on that element with the dynamic material we're creating here. So the source material, this is going to be the material we're going to use as the source for the dynamic instance. This needs to be our rusty metal material. So if we go ahead and click compile and save, we now have this rusty material on element index 2. And it's dynamic. Now we can actually just drag right off of here and keep scripting, but it's a good idea whenever you create a dynamic instance, especially when you create it through ConstructionScript, you may actually want to, in your event graph, modify that script over time. Maybe you have a game that's dynamic in that you want to basically have this rust kind of dynamically come into place. Well, that's something you would script during gameplay inside your event graph. ConstructionScript is just running in the editor to get this set up. So what we'll want to do is right click on a return value, which is actually giving us a reference to the dynamic material instance that we created, and click on promote to variable. And we'll just call this our rusty metal mid, MID. MID is short for material instance dynamic. So it's basically just shorthand or an acronym that the engine uses. So we basically saved this off as a variable. Now what we can do is we can actually take a reference to this variable, and we can actually say, well, let's set our scalar parameter. And we can actually even eliminating nodes. I'm always a fan of eliminating nodes. This is a reference to our material instance dynamic rusty metal that we just made. Also on the new set nodes in Unreal Engine 4.7, there's an output node right here that is also a reference to this variable. So we can actually delete this variable and drag out from the set node. That way we're kind of eliminating the need for that extra node. Now we are going to be telling this particular variable, which again is storing the return value of this new dynamic instance of the material we made, we're telling this material, we want you to set your scalar parameter value. We need to tell it the name of the parameter we're targeting. So in order to get that, we need to go into our rusty metal material, go find our parameter name, which we call blend value, click on that, right click and click copy, because it needs to be letter for letter exactly the same. If we had added a space in here or something like that and we didn't replicate that over here in our parameter name, then it wouldn't work. So that's why we copy it. Go ahead and in the scalar parameter value node for setting it, go ahead and paste that in. And we'll go ahead and set the value here. We want to right click and promote this to a variable, and we'll just make this rust amount. And let's go ahead and make this a public variable, and we'll make the tooltip the amount of rust to show. Now the cool thing with making this public like this is this rust amount variable will be available on every single instance of this rusty swing set that is around in the editor. So that is actually it for the scripting. Let's go ahead and click compile and save. And now what we can do is go back to the park. We have our swing set highlighted. And now what we can do is scroll down and find inside this section here our rust amount. It's in the default section because we actually haven't set a category for this. So let's really quick do that. It's always a good habit to be in. Back inside a rusty swing set, let's take our rust amount and make its category. Instead of default, let's just do setup. That would be a good one to name this. And we'll go ahead and click compile and save. And now when we're back in our park, we can see that we now have a setup section that has a rust amount. Right now it's at 0. Well, let's crank that to 2.5. And now we can see automatically we have a bunch of rust. Now that probably looks like a little bit too strong. It looks kind of gunky and not just rusty. So let's maybe back the setup down to like 1.2. That looks pretty good. So now you can see we have a little bit of rust here. And the cool thing is, if we wanted to, say, duplicate the swing set, if we wanted to have 2 of them, and I know it's clipping through my fence here, but just as an example, we could have this one have the really gunky, rust amount of 3 on here. And because these are separate instances of a blueprint, each with a separate instance of the material, they can actually have different values. Let's go ahead and delete the second swing set because we don't really need 2 of them. And that'll actually be it for this video. So that is how you set up a material instance dynamic, or a MID. And the really cool thing is you can now extend this even further by being able to, inside of our blueprint, actually access this material instance inside of the event graph, and you can call this set scalar parameter value as many times as you need to adjust how much rust is showing up. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to create a whole new blueprint that's going to actually incorporate not only dynamic material instances, but also be able to modify a light source inside your level through ConstructionScript.